There you are.
Hi,
Hi, buddy. How are you?
I'm good, Mo.
All right. So, you want to get started, or do you wanna get started immediately?
Sure, well, let's roll with the punches.
All right. Cool. So, welcome back to Read to Me Titi Bedtime Stories series, and I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Auntie Soy, and I'm very passionate about reading. I applaud this effort by Kevin and Elena. Really great idea because reading really is the foundation to education. So, um, I'm just taking some time tonight to read with my buddy Mo this book Protectors Pledge. So we're going to be just doing chapters 3 and 4 tonight. And yeah, so what's chapter 3 there, Mo?
All right. So, hi, everyone. I'm Mo. Um, you can just call me Coach Mo for short tonight. Um, Chapters 3 and Chapters 4 from The Protector's Pledge by Daniel Y.C. McLean. Chapter 3 is Beyond the Breadfruit Tree. And
And chapter
chapter
4,
4,
Stepping into the Dark.
yep, there we go. So what will happen? So I will start off chapter 3, and I guess we can just interchange in intervals to make sure we have a nice, fun story.
Sure, let's just give a little insight into the book for those of you guys who weren't able to join last night. Uh, Basically, in the Protectors Pledge, we're going to be meeting JV, who is a precocious and adventurous youngster. His granny B, who is the village healer, and a very mysterious stranger, Mr. Phipps. So JV he is determined to make his summer vacation, a very adventurous one, and he devises a special plan with his classmate Carol to go and explore the mysterious Oscuros Forest, which is a fixture in the middle of his village, Alcavere.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's just it in a nutshell. So over to you, Mo.
All right, so let's go.
Sure.
All right, so chapter 3, Beyond the Breadfruit Tree. It was close to 2:30 before JV left for the forest. He knew that Carol was going to kill him if she was still waiting around to do it. On the way home from the market, Granny B had mentioned a few chores that needed to be done. Some he had put off for weeks, like cleaning his room, and others he slipped in while he nibbled on tamarind balls. Watering the numerous potted and hanging plants along the front porch and helping her turn the kitchen from its current state of chaos into a gleaming, spotless space fell into this latter category. To make matters worse, on arriving home, they discovered that Mr. Phipps was gone, and with him, what was left of the bake and bulgjol, as well as JV's chances of getting useful information about the forest. JV wasn't too sure what made him angrier, the missing leftovers or his lost opportunity with Mr. Phipps. Well, at least he finally had two people to go exploring with, if we were still there. Hurry along. He was almost at the trap that would lead to Carol, Pascal, and the forest beyond when he spied a familiar yellow head wrap. Doris was heading toward Granny B's house. If he didn't think fast, she'd see him and bring an end to any plans he had for that afternoon. Ducking behind a tree, JV squeezed his eyes shut and held his breath. He counted to 30 and tentatively opened one eyelid. The coast was clear. Lickety split. He dashed through the track, his fingers crossed that Carol and Pascal hadn't given up and gone home. On turning at the next bend, he was happy to see that his fears were unfounded. Pascal, wearing a light blue long-sleeve shirt and jeans, sat on a tree stump swinging his legs. Given how hot the day was, JV bet that it wouldn't be long before the younger Pearson's sleeves and pant legs were rolled up. Carol, who was similarly dressed except that her shirt was yellow, paced behind Pascal, a scowl on her face. Seeing JV, she stopped abruptly and launched into reprimand. JV, you know how long we've been waiting here for you? She asked, arms folded across her chest and her left foot tapping the ground. JV bent over, hands on knees, and tried to catch his breath. Sorry, I'm late, he panted. Got held up at home. Thanks for waiting, though. Let's get going then, Carol huffed. Pascal and I have to be back home by 4. She started up the track without looking back. JV hoped that this was not a sign of how the rest of the afternoon would turn out. Hopping off his perch, Pascal skipped ahead to catch up with his sister, and JV, still breathing heavily from his sprint, followed. As the 3 adventurers marched on, the dirt track became less pronounced until it was completely lost beneath a thick carpet of leaves and brush. Expansive boughs hung overhead, the sunlight filtering between their smaller branches to create mottled golden brown patterns on the forest floor. All was still, but for the crunch of dry leaves and twigs under the feet of Carol, Pascal, and JV. It was as though the unforgiving heat over the past 7 months had drained the forest of any life. Deeper in they went. The forest became denser, making it impossible for JV to use the sun to gauge time. They proceeded in relative silence until Pascal broke the peace. Though, what if it like living with Boss B, JV? JV felt his pulse quicken.
Pascal, Carol hissed, giving her brother a hard look. Boss B is not her name, it's Miss B. She shot JV a quick, apologetic look. Undaunted, Pascal forged ahead. Well, what it like having with Miss B then? What do you mean? JV countered. Well, you know, everyone call her the Obia woman. People even think she ready for the Madus. Carol pursed her lips, crossed her arms, and glared at Pascal. But JV had already heard all the rumors. Granny B, who knew so much about herbs and plants, was generally respected as a skilled healer. But there were those in the village who believed her to be some sort of witch and ordered their children to keep a respectful distance, and others who were convinced that she was a little off. No, my granny doesn't deal in Obia, Pascal, and she isn't mad. She just knows a lot about nature and stuff. She's like a doctor who makes her own medicine from plants. JV was pleased with this calm answer. Oh, Pascal thought for a minute, and then his finger went up to his chin and began tapping. JV knew another question was on its way. And what about her humpback? Witches have humpback. JV sucked his teeth loudly. He was growing tired of the conversation. Yeah, well, they also have warts on their noses, pointy hats, black cats, and ride around on brooms. Granny B is not a witch. JV swatted angrily at the leaves on either side as he plowed through the forest. Carol, who had slowed to match her brother's pace, now trotted to keep up with JV's furious strides. You know, JV, I think we should probably stick to going in one direction, she said from somewhere behind him. It'll make it a lot easier to find our way out again. Do you even know what direction we're headed in? JV made a quick guess. I'd say northish. I don't think so, Carol said. See how the tips of those high branches at the top are all pointing in one direction? Well, that's east. So we're actually heading northwest. And you know, you really have thought to wear long sleeves and long pants like we did instead of that vest and shorts. Then you wouldn't get all scratched up and bitten. When JV had first seen Carol and Pascal on the track, he had thought them crazy to be dressed as they were, but they had been too polite to point that out. Too bad Carol couldn't return the favor. He thought sourly. She was right, of course. It was a lot cooler here in the forest, and his exposed arms and legs already bore insect bites. But who really cared about stuff like that anyway? They were here to explore. A few scratches and bites never killed anyone, he mumbled as he slapped at a mosquito on his shin. Behind him, Carol was saying something else. I think we should turn back, JV. It's probably around 3:30, and if Pascal and I get home late, Mommy won't come back to the forest with you again. What could be better, JV thought wickedly. It was a fleeting thought, but he was still quite miffed that the excursion hadn't turned out as he had envisioned. He didn't feel as though they had gone far enough or seen anything of much interest as yet. Just leaves, trees, and more trees. He wasn't sure exactly what he had been expecting, but he knew there was something more to the Oscuros that he needed to uncover.
Let's just go a little farther. For another 10 minutes or so, he didn't slow down and had gone for a few more paces before realizing that he no longer heard the snap of twigs or crunch of leaves behind him. The least those two could do is try to keep up. He turned around to tell Carol and Pascal just that and discovered that they were no longer following. There they stood, quite a way back, Carol with arms folded across her chest, looking peeved, and Pascal appearing torn between the urge to continue and not wanting to cross his sister. We are not going, JV, Carol said. We have to head back now. JV was in no mood to relent. Hoping to force another 10 minutes out of them, he decided to change tactics. Okay, well, since you're so good at directions, you'll have no problem getting back to the trap without me. For a moment, Carol's startled expression led JV to believe that he had won. Surely they would prefer to keep him going with them for another measly 10 minutes, rather than find their way out alone. He said, "See ya," turned his back and continued on. After a few paces, though, he wheeled around and was stunned to see no sign of Carol or Pascal. They had gone, disappeared. With a sinking feeling, he realized she had called his bluff, and he regretted his behavior. He bit on the nail of his baby finger. He had a decision to make. Should he go after them or press on by himself? On one hand, they had come in together and should leave together. He was also at that place in the forest where the breadfruit tree stood like a sentinel over a graying boulder, the very spot Granny Bee had cautioned him not to pass. Those were two very good reasons to call it a day, but on the other hand, Carol clearly had an excellent sense of direction and wouldn't have any trouble finding the track home. Plus, if he stayed in the forest, he could explore what lay beyond the breadfruit tree. His grandmother would never know. As JV stepped past the boulder, he felt a surge of excitement, tinged with apprehension. He was really doing it. He was heading into uncharted territory, and he was going it alone. Walking alone, he couldn't help but enjoy his surroundings. There wasn't much difference in the landscape on this side of the boulder. There were still trees and leaves as far as the eye could see, but somehow his senses sharpened. It seemed as though he was now aware of every sound, no matter how slight, from the rhythmic thud of his pulse to the gentle rustle of the leaves in the highest branches. He even heard the faint caw of a parrot and sounded what like the soothing gurgle of water somewhere in the distance. His eyes were drawn upward to a flicker of movement in a nearby saddlewood tree. Was that a pair of eyes peeking out at him from the leaves? He kept very still. From behind the screen of foliage, small back leathery fingers inched tentatively along the thick branch. Now, two human-like hands and long arms covered in dark hair came into view. Finally, a white face slowly emerged, and JV, who had been holding his breath up to this point, exhaled with a sigh of relief, and he was looking into the big brown eyes of a capuchin monkey. "Hey there, little fella. Came to keep me company?" The monkey blinked, bent his head to one side as though considering JV's invitation, and then slowly moved forward to reveal its white chest and rest of his body, which ended in a rounded stump where his long curling tail would have been. "What happened to your tail?" JV asked. The monkey looked back at his stump and then gazed down solemnly at JV. "Don't want to talk about it, huh? Anything you want to share with me about the forest then?" No response. "Well, I'm just going to keep heading this way, if you want to tag along." JV started walking and kept up his one-sided conversation with the monkey, who was following overhead, hopping along, adeptly jumping from tree to tree. "You know," JV said as he tramped on, looking up at his hairy comrade, "if we're going to be friends, I'd have to come up with a name for you. It's only right. Let's see. Bob? No. Spunky? Nope." He cast a glance at the monkey's nod behind and shouted, "I've got it. I'll call you Kirti. Short for curtail. Get it? I know you like."
An ear-splitting shriek from the monkey stopped JV in his tracks, and then, thwack! Newly christened Kirti had picked and hurled a hard green guava at JV, catching him squarely on the top of his head. "Ouch!" JV yelled, rubbing the sore spot. "You're not a fan of the name then? Well, if you can come up with something better, I'll change it. But until then, I'm calling you Kirti. And by the way, you're not the only one around here with good aim, you know. Bet I won't miss, even with the way that you're all up there." He scanned the ground for the guava or some other useful projectile, and his eyes locked on what looked like a partially hidden rusty lamp of metal at his feet. He bent over to take a closer look and gulped. He had been inches away from stepping on a trap. If Kirti hadn't screeched and thrown the guava, then the truth hit him. Kirti had known all about the trap and had saved him from getting caught in it. JV didn't have to guess how his little friend had lost his tail. He had never seen a trap this close up before, and shuddered to think of his own foot clamped between the two beastly rows of pointy iron teeth. It wasn't too difficult to imagine. He had seen such wounds on hunters who had somehow stumbled into their own traps and were brought to Granny B for healing. When they got to the house, they were never lucid enough to explain exactly how the accidents had occurred. And later on, when their faculties returned, they refused to talk of the incident. Some, like Arthur Samuel, gave up hunting altogether. JV stood and looked up at Kirti. "Thanks, buddy." In acknowledgement, Kirti jumped down to JV's shoulder and tugged on his ear. Reaching up, JV petted the silky fur. Oh, well, let's keep going. Just give a tug if you see me getting too close to any of the other traps. They continued on, JV telling Kirti all about his life, school, friends, vacation plans, and Granny B. And Kirti intently picking at JV's hair. Then, just as JV was relating the morning happenings with Mr. Phipps, he stopped talking. With mouth agape, he slowly looked around in silent, wide-eyed wonder. He was standing at the edge of a glade that could have been right out of a fairy tale. In the treeless clearing, golden beams of sunlight hit the earth, which was covered in a downy layer of soft green moss. Brown and white toadstools of varying sizes speckled the ground, and wild anthuriums and heliconias grew alongside a stream that opened into a dark pool, framed with wet, slippery rocks. The scene was stunning, but it was the beautiful woman leaning out of the pond and stretched over one of the larger rocks who held JV's attention. Her chin rested on crossed arms, and her eyes were closed. Drops of water sparkled on her ebony shoulders like diamonds in the setting sun, and JV stood spellbound for what seemed like an eternity. Then, without warning, her eyelids flicked up to reveal large greenish gold orbs. She fixed them on JV, holding him in a stare that pierced to his very soul. He had the most curious sensation of detachment as he thought he was no longer the master of his mind or body. Persistent tugs from Kirti brought JV out of his trance, and in the split second it took for JV to blink and refocus, the woman had disappeared. Did you see her, Kirti? Where did she go? JV raced towards the pond, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. No footprints, not even a strand of hair left on the big rock. He peered over the boulder and into the water. The surface was smooth as glass, and only the faces of a baffled boy and a curious monkey looked out at him from the murky depths. He was sure he hadn't imagined her, but how could she have just vanished? He stood for a moment, looking at the reflection of the sinking sun on the water, and remembered that he had to be out of the forest before the dark. Although he wanted to stay to see if the woman would return, he knew better. I should get along, he said, glancing around the clearing one last time. I really don't want to get caught out here with no light. Moving swiftly, he retraced his steps to the track, all the while thinking of the mysterious woman at the pond. What was her name? Where did she come from? Where did she go? He would just have to return to the glade tomorrow and wait for her, and perhaps Kirti would show up again too. The strange little monkey had jumped off his shoulder close to where they had met earlier and bounded away without so much as a backward glance. JV emerged from the forest as the last rays of sunlight vanished. He stepped onto the track towards home and then looked back at the trees. Was that children's laughter he heard, or only the wind in the leaves? He thought of Carol and Pascal then and felt the early pricks of a guilty conscience. Surely they'd be home safe by now. He dismissed the thought that they could still be in Oscuros and continued on his way. It was getting late.
That was chapter 3. And JV on his expedition into the forest, leaving his friends. So I guess we can head into chapter 4 and see what's up with that. Hey, Soy?
That's right. You take it away,
So,
Mo.
Right, so chapter 4, stepping into the dark. Urgent yells and a clamor of voices roused JV from sleep. What's going on? He groaned. Through bleary eyes, he could see that it was still dark. He rolled over. The digital clock next to his bed showed 11:17 p.m. in bright red numbers. He had returned home from the forest after 7 o'clock that night to find Granny B on the front porch, snoring lightly in her rocker. The second mug on the little wicker table, imprinted with a telltale orangey crimson shade of lipstick, indicated that Doris's visit must have recently ended and that his poor grandmother was suffering the after effects of the ordeal. He had gently woken her, offered an arm for support, and helped her to bed. Thankfully, she hadn't been alert enough to ask about his trip into Oscuros. She would have undoubtedly sussed out his less than stellar behavior toward Carol and Pascal, and somehow known that he had gone further into the forest than he was allowed, both to his detriment. By the time he had eaten supper, closed up the house for the night, and had a quick shower, it was 8 o'clock. A little early to be turning in by vacation standards, but a prudent choice. He wanted to be well rested to make proper amends to Carol and Pascal the next day, and of course, to try to find out more about the mystery lady by the pond. But now he was being awoken from his sleep by the racket outside. So with heavy eyelids for the second time that day, he unwillingly got out of bed. He shuffled to the window, pulled the curtains back, peeped outside, and rubbed both eyes before peering again, this time squinting to get a better look. Instead of the impenetrable darkness that usually stretched between his house and the forest, he saw flickering orange tongues from torches and a pale yellow spheres cast by lanterns. With eyes wide open now, he saw amidst the dancing cluster of lights a large group of villagers, their features distorted in an eerie glow, making enough noise to raise the dead. But from where he stood, he could neither identify any of the faces nor distinguish the words being yelled. JV doubted Granny B would be awake, but he still shouted, "Heading out to see what's going on." In less than 2 minutes, he was flying down the front porch steps, flashlight in one hand and slippers in the other. He tried to put them on as he ran toward the crowd that had positioned itself on the track before the forest. Nearing the group, he heard bits of conversation. She really missing? And what about the brother? He not around? Gone sometime earlier. Need to check the forest. His head spun. With a mounting feeling of dread, he feared that the hubbub had to be about Carol and Pascal. They mustn't have made it out of the forest. A knot formed in his throat, and his eyes welled with tears at the thought that because of his self-centeredness, his two friends were now lost somewhere in Oscuros, probably hungry, tired, and very frightened. If only he had turned back when they had asked, all three of them would have made it out safely. There was no question about it. He had to go in and help find them. He looked around and noted that most of the village was present. At the back of the assembly were the Simon Boy and Patrick Chin, with a cluster of village youth. Up front and center, impossible to miss in her multicolored hairnet, fuchsia nightgown, and matching robe, was Doris George, of course, presumably trying to help, but causing more confusion as he could tell. Even old Pa Gregory was there, standing off to the side.
JV inched closer to the front of the gathering where Mr. Pearson was clearly in charge of the rescue effort. JV marveled at him. How was he able to keep his composure with his children missing? Chin, Charles, Rollup, Jardine, and I will be leading groups into Oscuros, he shouted above this tumult. If you're going in, it must be with one of us. Group leaders, know who's going in with you and make sure you stick together. We're not losing anyone else tonight. And don't forget to watch out for traps. JV was thinking through what he was going to say to the father of his missing friends when Mr. Pearson caught sight of him, whispered a quick something to Mr. Charles at his side, and made his way through the crowd towards him. Distraught, JV found it hard to look the approaching man directly in the eyes. What would he say? How should he begin? Before he could come up with an answer to either question, all 6 feet 2 inches of Mr. Pearson were towering over him, and he was wishing that he could somehow shrink into his slippers. Just the person I wanted to see, Mr. Pearson said. Frowning, JV gulped, still unable to find his voice. You went into the Oscuros this afternoon with my children, didn't you? Yes, sir, JV whispered, head bowed. And the three of you decided to leave separately? The tears that JV had been holding back at bay began to run freely down his cheeks, and he looked up sorrowfully. It's my fault, he blurted out. I should have never let them leave without me. It's just that I was so excited to go exploring, and we hadn't seen anything interesting as yet. And Carol wanted to turn back so they wouldn't get home late. But I decided to continue for a few more minutes. And now they're lost and wandering around somewhere in there. He gestured towards the black trees. Mr. Pearson laid a hand on JV's shoulder. Calm down, son, he said. What's this about Carol and Pascal? They're at home as we speak, safe and sound. They were a little rattled when I caught them trying to sneak in the house, and they wouldn't tell me much about the trip. But they're okay. He paused and gave JV a meaningful look. Of course, we had a serious chat about their getting home later than we had agreed on. The reprimand barely registered with JV. His mind was processing the wonderful news that his friends were okay, while simultaneously trying to figure out what was really going on. Then who is missing? He asked. Mr. Pearson glanced at a small group that had broken off to the right where they were standing. Little Adele Decoto, he murmured. No one can find her. And that's what I wanted to ask you. Did you see any sign of her in the forest or on your way home earlier? JV stood, shook his head slowly. No, I didn't see anyone else except for... Who? Mr. Pearson asked quickly, his eyebrows raised. JV had been about to mention the lady at the pond, but was beginning to have his doubts about her existence. The more he thought of her, the less likely the whole thing seemed. No one could confirm what he saw, or thought he saw, and she had disappeared much too quickly. The encounter also had an eerie, almost surreal quality to it. So his eyes could have been playing tricks on him. No, there wasn't any reason to say something that would make him look like a fool or a potential patient of Dr. Morris, the island's mental hospital. St. Maurice, the island's mental hospital. I was only going to say Carol and Pascal, he finished. Oh, Mr. Pearson sighed. His eyes wandered again to the group at the fringe of the gathering. JV followed his gaze and noticed that Earl Ducoto was at the center of the small circle, his eyes more hollow and cheeks more sunken than usual. He was leaning heavily on another man, and those around him were expressing their solidarity with gentle pats on the back and light squeezes to his shoulders. JV didn't see Paulette Ducoto anyway. He thought of how tired and disheartened she had seemed that morning at the market. JV pictured her waiting at home for her daughter, praying that Adele would return to them. Well, all right then, Mr. Pearson said, looking again at JV. I'm going to get this search started. Let me know if you remembered anything that could be useful. He walked away, and JV watched as the crowd slowly began to separate into groups.
Making his way to the nearest search party, JV realized that something was nagging at him. What was it that Mason had said in the market when Mrs. Ducoto had complained about Adele's previous disappearance? Something about baby animals? JV tried to wrap his head around the memory and wondered whether it could be a clue to her whereabouts. Standing at the back of the group of 7, he listened as Mr. Chin did a head count. The fishmonger looked at each face intently for a few seconds, then, with his characteristic quick-fire delivery, recapped all the do's and don'ts of the forest, asked if there were any questions, and said, "Good, let's get going." With the lantern held high and a brisk pace, Mr. Chin led his group down the track toward the dark mouth of Oscuros. As they crossed into the untamed territory, JV immediately understood why Granny B always insisted that he make sure the trees were behind him before nightfall. The gloomy forest that let in very little light between its heavy boughs during the day turned into a sinister monster once the sun had set. The blackness was like a pack of hungry wolves, menacing the group with every step, clawing at their heels and forming a tight circle around them. Even the lanterns and flashlights that they brandished lost their potency and were almost completely absorbed by the darkness. This wooded world, where silence seemed to reign during the daylight hours, was replaced by a living, breathing entity that creaked, hissed, grunted, rustled, and hooted. Being the youngest, JV had been ushered to the middle of the group, with Mr. Chin in front, 2 others on either side, and the Simon boy, Randall, bringing up the rear. JV was happy with the formation, except for his lack of confidence in the scraggly teen's ability to provide any protection should they be attacked from behind. Growl! JV leapt into the air as a vicious snarl, with its accompanying hot breath, forced its way directly into his ear. Behind him, Randall howled in laughter. "Nice jump, little man, nice jump. You should play basketball," he said, grinning and clapping. "Or not. You're way too short for that." Mr. Chin, usually a good-tempered soul, whipped around and pointed at Randall. "Boy, you better stop your foolishness. We're not in here for fun, you know." "Yes, sir." Still snickering, Randall gave Mr. Chin a mock salute. They trudged along, calling Adele's name and faintly hearing other voices do the same above the sounds of the forest. JV was so focused on detecting even the smallest sign of her presence that he didn't immediately notice how quiet Randall had become. When he did turn around to see what the mischief maker was up to, he found that his rear guard was no longer there. "These pranks have got to stop," JV said under his breath. Then he spied a shadowy figure dark behind the trees a few yards back to the left. He inhaled sharply and shone his light on the spot. The only movement he saw, however, came from a bat crawling up the cracked bark of one of the trunks. He inched closer, squeezing the flashlight in both hands before him, imagining its beam was also a shield against all the terrible creatures that could lunge for him at any moment. "Cut it out, Randall," he shouted. "This isn't funny." There was no reply. By this time, the group had stopped moving forward. Mr. Chin had doubled back and was now standing next to JV. "What's going on?" Chin asked, the light from his lantern bobbing and weaving as he gesticulated. "Where's that silly boy?" "Not sure," JV replied, "but I think he may be behind those trees back there." His flashlight was still aimed at the trunks, and Mr. Chin's eyes followed the beam. "Randall, boy, you better pray I don't find you playing the fool behind there," Mr. Chin shouted, marching towards the trees. "If I were a different kind of man, I would leave you in this forest tonight. That would teach you a good lesson." But as far as Mr. Chin neared the presumed hideout, Randall came sauntering out of the bushes from the opposite direction. JV, not expecting to see him emerge from the right, did a double take. "Wait a minute. How did you get all the way over there?" he asked, flicking his light back and forth between the spot where he thought Randall had been hiding and where the young man, now unquestionably the object of everyone's vexation, was standing. But JV's question never received a reply. Randall had barely rejoined the group when Mr. Chin stalked across, closing the distance between them with swift strides, then grabbed him by the shoulders.
"You think this is a game?" he barked. "You like wasting people's time when a little girl may be lost out there in the dark? This is a joke for you?" Randall shrugged free and took a step back, holding up his arms. "Hey, ease up, old man," he said. "I just needed a little privacy to take a leak, you know." Mr. Chin opened his mouth as if to say something and then shut it again. He glared at Randall until the boy looked away. With everyone now gathered around, Mr. Chin cleared his throat, raised his lantern, and said the words JV had dreaded hearing, that it was time to call off the search and head back to the village. Mr. Chin pointed out that despite having spent hours in Oscuro, they had failed to find Adele or anything that could lead them to her, and there was little more that they could do, as tired as they were. Having made the decision to leave, the group re-established its formation, this time with Randall up front with Mr. Chin, and began retracting its steps out of Oscuros. Despite his disappointment over the failed mission, JV remained on the lookout for Adele, but also for tall, lurking shadows, as well as the mysterious woman's yellow-green eyes, which he assumed would glow in the dark. There was now, he noted with alarm, an ever-growing list of things linked to Oscuros that warranted further investigation. The trip out of the forest seemed shorter than expected, but JV still released a sigh of relief once his back was to the final stand of trees, and he could look up and see the twinkling stars in the night sky. His group was the last to emerge from Oscuros. The crowd before them was silent, mostly still and full of sagging shoulders. The faces within it lit up momentarily as JV and others approached, only to quickly lose any trace of optimism when they realized that Adele was not among the new arrivals. No one seemed to know what to do next. Mr. Dakota, who had been too ill to venture into the forest, was led away sobbing. the villagers began to disperse. Within minutes, only a few persons were left behind, talking in smaller groups, including Doris George and her two neighbors, who were rehashing the night's events. And that is why I don't let my children anywhere near that forest, Mr. Talbot was saying. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his mouth was set in a hard line. The others nodded. Well, I'm sure that it's that Trixie Dixon criminal, Doris declared. I know he took her. It was only this morning I was telling everybody that Alcavere is just the place that Jailbird would want to come. A 2x4 little village where no one would think to look for him. And see, that's exactly what happened. The convict was here and he took little Adele. Who knows if we ever going to see that sweet child again? She pulled a large handkerchief from the top of her nightgown and dabbed at her eyes. Now wait a minute, Doris, Miss Jean piped in. Don't go jumping to conclusions. We don't know if that's what really happened here. Then where is she? Where did the child go? Doris countered. Miss Jean looked back at the dark trees. Well, it is Oscuros we now talking about. She might just show up one of these days at the edge of the forest, like Miss B's boy. They moved off, still speculating what had become of Adele Decoto. JV was standing nearby and had heard every word.
Excitement, secrets of Oscuros.
I know, right?
Yeah, so I think I want to know what's happening tomorrow in chapters 5 and 6 to know what happens with JV and Pascal and if they find Adele. I don't know.
I know.
What secret you think is up, Soy?
I don't know, but we had to stay tuned in and we have to encourage everyone else too. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. So I know tomorrow there will be 2 new readers with the Read2Me, fun for TT for chapters 5 and chapter 6. So I guess we have to encourage them to come and find out what happened next to Adele and see if JB is able to find her. What do you think?
Absolutely. But it's excitement down the line.
Yeah, it is. It is. Really secrets of Oscuros. All right. So before we go, we would like to say thanks for joining us tonight. But please make sure to wash your hands with soap and make sure you do that hygienic stuff, sanitation. Wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Or sing happy birthday to yourself whilst doing it to make sure that it's done correctly. Yes, so exactly like that. Exactly like that, And if anybody's heading out, please ensure to let mommy, daddy, granny, grandpa wear those masks. Very important, in this fight against COVID. So anything you want to say before you go, Soy?
Well, it was a pleasure connecting with you, Uncle Mo.
Same with you, Auntie Soy. Same with you.
It's all good.
It's all good. So I think we had a lot of fun tonight.
Absolutely. Yes.
So before we go, we see you all again tomorrow. And happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. Have a wonderful day tomorrow.
Absolutely. Take care, guys.
All right, Auntie Soy. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Anaya.